All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, it is the summer of 1926, and the legendary journalist Ida Tarbell is visiting Italy and reporting on the rise of Benito Mussolini for an American audience. And the articles she is publishing are not so great. They're flattering portraits of Mussolini, sometimes comparing him to Napoleon, lauding the social programs he's implementing, downplaying, the fascism that's sort of at the heart of it all. And I should say this is the first time we've talked about Tarbell on this show, and I feel a little bad that it's in the context of this kind of late career drift towards Mussolini, because Tarbell was one of the pioneering investigative journalists of the progressive era. She wrote incredibly critically throughout the teens and 20s about big business in this country, and she probably was directly responsible for legislation that broke up oil companies and other monopolies. Mm-hmm. But folks, the calendar is the calendar. Here we are in late summer. We were looking for stories, and lo and behold, in 1926, Ida is in Italy and kind of falling for Mussolini in this very interesting way. So here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We will do why was Ida Tarbell so influential and what all the great muck-raking she did in the 20s, for sure. I'll just say kind of the larger interesting theme here is that people's politics drift, but also I think there's, but I also think that there's this very interesting thing that I think is, feels resonant to me now too, where, we find progressives finding common cause or being wooed by autocrats. And I think there's some interesting stuff we're noticing in the culture and our politics now. And I think we can see that in this story. But who was Tarbell? Let's look at, the career, the muck-raking, the impact domestically, and then we'll talk about these excursions to Italy.
So Ida Tarbell is probably one of the most famous female journalists of the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. She writes a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company, which explodes onto the American scene because it's responsible for the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company monopoly, the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, multiple pieces of major legislation. She does that with one book. We could all hope that we could do that with one book. But she also writes a lot of big biographies. So she writes a biography on Napoleon, and she writes a biography on Abraham Lincoln. And I kind of think that part of her perhaps obsession or maybe adoration of Mussolini is in the same way that she admires someone like a Lincoln or like a Napoleon or like these other big, huge figures. She sees their charisma, she sees their leadership or their ability to make decisions, and that is attractive to her in some way.
Especially in this era of stronger and stronger presidents. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was something of an aberration in the 19th century as somebody who was really able to control national policy, in part because he was a wartime president, that he made big, bold moves in order to get what he wanted as president, including things like during the war suspending habeas corpus, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Like, he was making big, bold moves. And by the time that Tarbell comes out with her book, The History of Standard Oil, you have another pretty active president in Teddy Roosevelt. And even though Teddy Roosevelt was pretty annoyed with muckraking journalists like Tarbell, he's the one that gives them the name muckrakers because he thinks that they're too busy sort of like scraping through the muck and coming up with these sensationalistic stories rather than, working in the high realm of politics. He needs them, because they publish their stories, whether it's Ida Tarbell or whether it's somebody like Upton Sinclair writing about the meatpacking industry, and it helps him to promote this legislation that he wants in order to strengthen the federal government and use government power to make lives better for people, which is kind of where the progressives were as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting reframing that I think helps explain this story of the progressive era. We, I guess, tend to think of it as one in which, there were a lot of reforms and unions were maybe more powerful and big monopolies were getting broken up, but they were getting broken up with a sort of clenched fist smashing them over the head, right. Of presidential power or whatever. And so I think we start to then maybe get a sense of, as you were saying, people like Tarbell, their view of government. I think the through line in many ways is you can be skeptical of corporate power. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have a particular approach to governmental power. You can still sort of find common cause with very strong governmental forces, even if you're skeptical of monopolistic private forces.
Mm-hmm. And we should say, progressives weren't entirely opposed to democracy or populism. No. They are responsible for changing the Constitution, so there's a direct vote in the Senate, which was about, again, breaking up corruption. So they had a lot of different solutions. But I think Kellie's right, if you look at the folks that Tarbell was writing about, that there is something appealing about having strong, centralized power to get the things done that you want to get done.
I mean, and Mussolini, when he bursts onto the scene, Tarbell says, Italians have found their Moses. I was like, ooh. Whoa. I mean, that's a strong statement. But again, I think it's because, he comes in completely forcefully. And that's one of the things that she really leaves out of her critique is the violence and the force that is accompanied by his leadership. She seems to only look at the decisions, the forceful decisions that he's making and not how much he's harming people in his wake.
And there is something about the Mussolini fascination and this idea that, not only were progressives interested in strong leaders generally, but this idea that Italians were ungovernable in general, right? There's a little bit of anti-Italian racism in this idea that actually, who needs a strong man to get Italians to get their act together? It was this idea that that it was a fractious country and that the Italian people were not self-motivated, maybe not entirely fit for democracy.
Yeah, all the stereotypes fall into play and fit very nicely into this package.
No. And, it is worth pointing out that Tarbell is not alone in this. It's not like she's just kind of on her own journey or whatever. I mean, a lot of the sort of her muckraker cohort are doing this, are looking to Europe, in the wake of World War I and seeing Mussolini. But, Lincoln Steffens called him a, quote, divine dictator. Samuel McClure, another, big name in muckraking journalism of the time, said that he found him, quote, full of force and charm and kindness. Even Ernest Hemingway seemed to be under the spell for a little bit. He would eventually kind of changed his politics pretty quickly, but in the 1920s at least, was taken by Mussolini's charm. And it does seem like at some level, I guess, Kellie, this is to your point, but personal charm and just sort of being enamored of this figure was a big part of this as well, which I suppose for a writer, will always be appealing. Here is an appealing character.
Yeah, that's always, there's a certain seduction that comes with the way people use their words or carry themselves that evokes this sense of like an amour. And I think that Mussolini definitely had that. But a lot of powerful dictators have that about them. And it's not necessarily about looks. You know, it's not like, oh, he's 6 feet tall, dark and handsome. You know, like it's about the way that they carry their power, the way that they use their power, that in some ways is alluring to people. If you ask me, it's highly problematic. But
I would say so.
But that appeal, we see that time and time again.
And you marry that with the kind of managed news that was coming out of Italy at the time. I mean, the head of the Associated Press's bureau in Rome was a pro-fascist journalist, Salvatore Cortese. And so the reports that Americans were getting from Italy were that this rising power was more or less benevolent, right? Cortese wasn't writing about the violence that was happening, and we're talking about the street gangs. And so for the journalists who were in Italy and who were witnessing these attacks, they were able to have a more clear-eyed view than somebody like Tarbell, who sort of swans in and is given the dictator's royal treatment, and has this rosier view because it hasn't been necessarily contravened by the press reports they're reading. And
I mean, all of this is so resonant. I mean, I think that this sort of controlling the press, controlling the narrative, obviously that's a playbook that not just in Italy. I mean, you think of Berlusconi, who sort of got his start through having a media stranglehold. But yeah, the fascist playbook, the autocrat playbook, involves kind of crafting these narratives and the wooing of influential voices, and we see that throughout the 20th century to now, where you get these, you get reporters who are seduced to you, Kellie, I think that's the right word, or in the thrall of people. And so now that's happening at home as well, as well as with foreign autocrats. But
then you get people who do have an about face, like Ernest Hemingway changes his opinion, and he says, "I was like, oh, that hurts." He called him the great bluff of Europe, and then he said that he was a man who expressed small ideas with big words. Yeah, and I was like, ooh.
And, Hemingway is, I've been reading and thinking about Hemingway a little bit lately because I'm reading a book about Americans who ended up in the Spanish Civil War, and Hemingway was over there sort of poking around as well. And, that's anti-fascist, and you see, I think, just in general in this era, wake of World War I into World War II, you see a lot of Americans who are kind of politically minded, journalists and others, looking to Europe and looking to all of the sort of different strains of politics and that are emerging between the rise of Mussolini and the Spanish Civil War, and obviously the rise of fascism further east. And a lot of people are sort of going over there and sort of getting involved in one way or another. And we'll find an excuse to do an episode about Americans in the Spanish Civil War because it's super fascinating.
That would be great. Yeah.
We should note F. Scott Fitzgerald, who sort of is another name poking around here, reportedly from the beginning was like, don't trust that guy. Held true. Not a Mussolini fan, so there you go. Good for him. But coming back to this larger question of both, I think, the progressive era, but also just like progressivism and these sort of interesting edges of it. Does this help, or does this kind of reframe for us a little bit of what the progressive era was and what progressivism in that moment meant?
I think so, because one thing that we often lose when we're looking back at the past is a sense of contingency and what's not known. And progressives at the time are trying to figure out how to use government to do what they see as good things. And they talk about good government and they talk about reforms. And sometimes they even talk about the people as something good. Sometimes they don't trust the people that much. They're interested in experts. They're interested in technocracy. And at the time, an idea like fascism, which we hear and we're immediately like, oh, that's a bad thing, people don't know what to make of it yet. Yeah. And of course, there are progressives who, interested in the power of government, see somebody using the power of government, as they said at the time, like make the trains run on time and to help discipline what they see as a rowdy population. They see that as something that's good because they're interested in controlling populations. And so I think it helps us have a more nuanced view, not just of progressives, but of Americans more broadly at the time.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because I think all of these writers or big leaders that Ida Tarbell is writing about, they're all extremely flawed. Lincoln's really flawed. Napoleon, extremely flawed. And even these big corporations, Standard Oil, really, really problematic. And so we have the hindsight to be able to step back and look at all this history and have all of this knowledge. But Ida Tarbell is looking at it right in the moment that she's living in. And I think in some ways, she's writing with a sense of myopia, too, about the full picture of who these people are.
Yeah. Niki, as a watcher of modern kind of media environment, I'm curious if you feel like there's any resonance here for, what I see as like former progressives, former, lefty, especially like muck-raking journalists who have a sort of skepticism of power, weirdly finding, common cause with Trumpism and at the very least being like, what is it? The anti-Trump, but do you see that at all sort of in this?
Oh, yeah. And I think the dynamics are a little different than in the progressive era, but when you make heterodoxy the central component of your personality and your identity, it can lead you into some pretty bad places if it's not bound by a higher set of values. And so when you see people, should we name check people?
Yeah, we can name Glenn
If you
Greenwald.
see people like Glenn Greenwald floating into those camps, it is... It's fascinating, right? Because skepticism of power in one corner becomes a blind allegiance to it in others. And that is pretty interesting from a political viewpoint and from a psychological viewpoint.
Yeah. There you go. That is very well said. And we will leave it there. And I promise we will, maybe dive into other chapters of Tarbell's life and work, because there are some very interesting things there. But this has been super fascinating. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.